My name is Jordan, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of SmartPhone. And we recently we did our full launch with RAI Sift to integrate our phone system, text messaging, mobile apps, and power dialer directly into RAI Sift. So compliance. The thing about the way I always think about compliance, particularly, everybody on this call is a real estate investor. So or involved in real estate investing. And if you can't get leads, your business dies. If you can't talk to people, your business dies. So taking an attitude towards compliance, like, I don't care, I'm just going to do whatever I want because I need leads and I want to convert, that's a short-term gain with a long-term pain for a business, right? Because you can decide to act however you want, and it may work for a little bit of time, but sooner or later, compliance, like the IRS, the FCC, catches up with you, and then your business can get shut down. So it's incredibly important, and it's actually a lot easier than you think. So people think one of the problems with compliance, and I think it's a problem in general with anything around this, accountancy, finance, banking, government, is there's all sorts of acronyms and rules and massive big papers they give out. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of it is actually, it's very simple, and it's actually very good for you as a business. The reason, in my opinion, compliance is out there is not to punish businesses, but to punish bad businesses. It's not to punish people who are legitimately trying to do business. It's to go after the people who are causing problems, right? And so if you break that down into with your own mindset of, compliance is actually a tool I can use. Being compliant is a tool I can use as a business owner to make sure my business is more resilient for the future, then it's actually an important thing to deal with right away, and it's an important thing to embed into your general business practice. So I'm going to, in this webinar today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to very briefly kind of break down compliance and some of the key bits around compliance for both voice, calling, and text messaging. So let's talk about voice for a little bit. Obviously, the first thing I want to kind of point out, and I'm not going to quite do one of those, this is not legal advice, please don't hold me, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer. And actually, more importantly, every state in the US has slightly different laws. So it's really important that as you guys look at compliance, you look at compliance as it relates to your individual state and the states that you are calling. Not just your state. Like if you're in one state and you're calling and you're working in markets in other states, you need to make sure you understand the basics of the compliance setup in each place that you're calling and doing business. So I do encourage you to look at it. Most of the times the rules are pretty close, but it's important you look at it. And now when we're talking about voice compliance, the first thing you have to do, whichever phone system you're using, if you're using an online system like SmartPhone, the first thing you're going to want to do to establish compliance is to register inside of the trust center inside of that platform. So I can only talk to you about SmartPhone and what we do, but if you set SmartPhone up, you're going to find that you have a trust center inside of SmartPhone, and that's where you're going to manage most of your compliance elements. And you've got to register your business immediately in there. The reason being is that this first item on the spreadsheet, on the PowerPoint, stir shaken, which actually does come from James Bond, by the way, shaken, not stirred. But stir shaken is essentially a method the carriers and the FCC are using to make sure that a phone number that is making a call is verified to be part of a business that is a verified business, so that the connection between you and the person you're calling can be made and verified and graded accordingly, right? So it is an FCC thing. There's nothing you have to do apart from register and get your business approved inside of the SmartPhone Trust Center. Do it. If you haven't do it today. It's the first step you're going to need to do. It's super easy to do. All you need is your business, your EIN or your DUNS number, your website address, and certain bits of information around your business and the people who are authorized representatives. It should take you no more than 5 minutes to do. And that is the first step. and that at that point, stir shaken, once approved, will be automatically applied to all your calls, and you don't have to worry about it. That's done. Simple, right? 5 minutes. Now, the next two things are a little more complex because there are two things that I think are really important for people to understand when it comes to voice compliance. And the first is the DNC register. Now, pretty much everybody in the US will know that you can put your number on a do not call list, right? Now, you can do that by registering into the do not call list. There's a central register you can put your number in. And of course, you can tell someone on the phone, take me off, do not call me again, please. And then that you're giving an individual instruction to someone like a business to not call you again. DNC is really important because if you start calling, if you buy a list and you just start calling that list, and there's a bunch of numbers on there that have registered themselves on the DNC list, that is a TCPA violation. And that will come back because that will come back via the carriers to us. It'll be flagged up and we're going to have to deal with it and deal with your account. You cannot call a number that is on the DNC list unless they have given you permission or unless you have a business relationship with them. You cannot call them. So keep yourself compliant and make sure before you are dialing any sort of list of people you don't know well, send it through a DNC scrubber. We've got one inside a smartphone and there's lots around the place. There's lots of systems that can do DNC scrubbing, but make sure that you are regularly scrubbing your lists so that you are abiding by that central register. That is one really important thing people don't do enough. And the moment you start calling a DNC number, the moment the TCPA violations kick in. Simple to do. Takes minutes. It doesn't cost a lot of money. So that's one. The second thing around voice compliance that I want to talk about here is this notion of existing business relationships. And it kind of relates to the DNC in some ways. Most states have a 90-day EBR rule. Now, I'm saying most states, and I really encourage you to look at the rules in your state because there are differences. So don't take 90 days as an absolute. Take it as a guidance that you should look up what your EBRs are. But an existing business relationship is established every time you have an inbound communication from someone. You're essentially starting a timer on how long you can reach out to them without getting new consent, right? So if someone calls me in, say I'm working a lead and they call me, that essentially, the moment they call or text me inbound, that starts that EBR timer. And I've then got, in most states, 90 days where I can reach out to them whenever, like I can reach out to them without being asked to follow up. And it's within that EBR framework, so it's perfectly valid to do, including if they've put their name on the DNC list, because they've called you, they've contacted you, they've given you essentially an EBR that has a period of time which you can reach out to them. And it's really important that you make sure that you abide by that, because one of the things that happens when a compliance violation happens is it comes back through to your phone system like us. We then look at the case, and if you can show us, no, look, we contacted them, but it was within the EBR, we take that back to the carriers, and that's the evidence we use to make sure that they're unblocking and releasing your accounts and not flagging you at all. So these are really important things to understand, and it's really good if you make sure you can track that existing business relationship, because then you know you've got that window, right? So those are some really important things around voice compliance that I always like to drill in, because they're actually really easy to do, but they're incredibly important, because the moment you start not doing them, the moment the TCPA violations kick in immediately. For text messaging, I'm going to take this in two halves. This first one deals with the basics of understanding what is important around consent and compliance for text messaging. The second half, I'm going to talk about this new A2P 10DLC framework that matters so much to everybody. So first of all, when it comes to text messaging, one of the most important things you can do is make sure that you're demonstrating you have consent to text message. Now, that EBR that I talked about for voice, that applies to text messages as well, right? So if someone has called you and you're in a comment and you've got that window of time where you can reach out to them. But one of the areas that is an immediate request from all carriers the moment there's a text message violation is show us where you've got consent. show us your opt-in consent process. And so, if you are gathering in leads, if you are getting leads to call you from bandit signs, if they're coming through your websites, et cetera, you need to make sure you have a procedure for gathering consent to text message people. And you need that procedure written down and clearly documented so that you can, and of course, implement it as well. But you have to show that you've gathered consent or that you have an EBR. And that's something, it's not enough to just be like, well, they filled in a form. If they're filling in a form, they've got to text that it's okay. They tick a box that it's okay for you to get consent to send a text message. One of the ways I've also seen it done is if you're on, say you're calling someone and it's a cold lead and you're on the phone and they're like, look, I'm not ready right now, but maybe in a couple months. One of the things I usually do talk to people about when they're in that situation is say to them, when you're presuming you're recording the call, particularly, say to them, is it okay if I text you? And get their verbal consent. And then once that call is over, send them a text that confirms the opt-in to receive text. You can't actually get opt-in from text, but you can confirm that they've opted in, essentially. So that's just a really, it's really important that you've got a demonstrable way of getting opt-in. The second is to make sure you identify yourself and your company. One of the biggest things that the carriers ask whenever we have violations are, why aren't your texts telling who you are and what your company is? Because they want to see that to make it a legitimate business text. Otherwise, they treat it as scam. They treat it as a scam or a spam likely, and they're going to go after those text messages. So you actually need to clearly identify yourself and your company and a clear way of opting out. And that, so that is something like, reply stop to opt out, right? To stop texting. And finally, as part of all this, it's important to refresh consent. So say you are in a relationship, an EBR, and you're texting back and forth, or you've got someone on a drip sequence because they're in an EBR and you want to follow up with them. Every 2 months, it's a good idea to make sure the text messages re-identify your company and the opt-out process. It's just a way of making sure that you are always giving transparency, because that's really what this is all about, right? What compliance is really all about is the carriers making sure that businesses are identifying who they are, why they're texting, and giving consumers an easy route to stop it. That's what they really want. It's not actually about punishing people. It's about trying to make sure that the basics of fairness are adhered to. And the final bit I'll talk about before we go into questions or comments from Tyler or any of you is this, the A2P 10DLC. For those of you, I mean, if you're doing any sort of text messaging in the United States, you'll have heard about this. It's essentially a new protocol that the carriers have developed to deal with text messaging via a system like smartphone, an online application like smartphone. And there's a couple things about 10DLC that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. And the first is, obviously, you need to do it. If you're not doing it, if you decided not to do it or you haven't done it yet, you need to get in that trust center, you need to register, and you need to get the A2P process done immediately, because text messaging is now being shut off for people who are not registered, right? And there's a deadline at the end of this month where text messages that are not registered will simply stop being sent for a lot of carriers. So if you haven't done it, get in there and do it. The second is take your time and fill in the form properly. A surprising amount of people just go through, put like 2 words and then to go, yeah, I've done it. Guess what? It gets rejected. And that's another 5 to 10 days where we have to go through a rigmarole of getting a new one developed and trying to get it approved. So take your time and make sure you are fully detailing the ways you get consent from people. You're fully detailing why you're sending text messages. Give them as much detail in as clear way as possible to make sure that you have the best chance to succeed. If you simply go, yeah, we get consent, they're going to reject that. They're going to reject it, and it's going to take another 10 days to get it approved. And in that time, you're liable to get your text messages stopped. So spend a few minutes and do it properly. The second point here is campaign type. For most people, unless you're doing much more bulk messaging towards people like buyers, where you're sending out a marketing message, for most people, you're doing transactional follow-up text messaging. You're talking to sellers on a kind of follow-up basis, a back and forth basis. In which case, most people are going to want to select a low volume standard campaign in the A2P. It's the cheapest, it's the quickest to do, and it allows you to send, I think it's up to 5,000 text messages a day. Oh, oh God, I'm gonna have to look at that. 5,000 or 6,000 text messages a day, which is more than enough for almost everybody doing just normal back and forth text messaging. It's super simple to do, it's super quick, and it's super cheap. So, try and get that underway as quickly as possible. And then if you've got other more dedicated use cases, like you want to send larger volumes of text to your buyers, like you want to text all your buyers about a property, that's a more specific use case where you want to use a more specific type of campaign, because the carriers care about this. They will compare what you've put as a message sample with what you're sending. And if it doesn't look right, they will come back and say, that's not correct, this is a violation. So don't think that you just can fill in this form and be done with it. And then the final thing I would just say is, it's a good idea to have a strategy for what your phone numbers are as well, right? So if you are, for instance, using Smart Dialer to do a higher volume of follow-up calls, you want to have a dedicated pool of numbers that are just dedicated to that. You want to have a dedicated pool of numbers for your internal staff to do follow-up calls, right? Think about your number strategy so that you can apply the right type of compliance protocol to it. Don't just blast every number with every way and don't use every number for Smart Dialer and follow-ups and, because what you end up doing is you end up putting a heavy load on your numbers, and you're going to end up getting them flagged as spam or whatever else. So think a bit about what your numbers are, what they're doing, and where they're best applied to in the compliance journey. So that's a kind of overall on compliance.